Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Spectre here. Another edition of Midnight Rider. Trying to get back in the swing of things here and get back on the side of the clock I'm normally accustomed to for this show. But tonight on the broadcast, we got a few things to discuss. In case you hadn't noticed by way of the title, got gold, sound money picking up steam? Well, that is the question. Tonight on the broadcast, we're going to take a little walk back through the last few years and see what has been going on with some of the states around the United States, with states actually going against the Fed and reintroducing gold and silver back as sound money. We'll take a look at that on the front end and where things are today. Here recently, we've had a couple breakthroughs of some other states also gaining ground in that regard, so we're going to take a look at it all. We'll see you back here momentarily on the other side. Warning. These social media platforms may be hazardous to your health. Censorship kills. Pain coming. This has been a PSA by Breaking Spectre. Alright, welcome back everybody. Appreciate you guys tuning in here this evening. If you're joining on the YouTube side, good to have you. Twitch, DLive, all up, as well as our friends over on Tiger Network. Good to see you guys there. Before you leave, make sure you like, share, and subscribe across all the various platforms should something happen and we get taken down, get a little censored or what have you. Hence why I show the PSAs and that I do, and why I'm on the platforms that I am. So make sure you do that on the way out, and do share this across whatever remaining platforms you may be on. Try and spread this information out. That being said, let me just jump right into it here this evening. I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach here on the front end of this. And I think what ultimately will happen here is at the conclusion of this broadcast, as I typically put out on Gab TV and over on UGEtube, I'm probably going to take bits and pieces of this and turn it into a PSA, and so I've kind of got the makings of it going on the front end here, and then I'll add in the back end pieces at the end and kind of use that as a running PSA on subsequent episodes here, so stick with me. Alright, so obviously kind of looking at things from a 30,000 foot view, if you will, and perhaps even dating back a couple hundred years. You know, one of the things that our founders told us and put in the Constitution, especially in Article 1, Section 8, pertaining to the powers of Congress, we know that the House of Representatives was intended to be the body of folks who are supposed to do this. And Part 5 says to coin money, regulate the value thereof and of foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures. Now, what do we have here today? Is that exactly that? No, of course not. They abdicated their authority and, of course, shoved that off to the Federal Reserve, which is neither federal nor a reserve, right? And, of course, if you've followed people like Ron Paul over the years, you know, his mantra of end the Fed still rings true to this day. So, a bit of a place marker here we saw back on August 21st, 2017, when we saw then Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, as well as old Mitch McConnell, down at Fort Knox. And this also happened to be the day we saw the solar eclipse in this country here. Tweet by Mnuchin on that day says, thanks to @US Mint staff for hosting at hashtag Fort Knox, hashtag USBD, first @US Treasury Secretary to visit since John Snyder in 1945. Glad gold is safe. And of course, again, highlighting the fact that you've got people like Rand Paul now bearing the torch of trying to audit the Fed. One, we have no idea in terms of the Fed what they have, nor do we necessarily know for sure what is actually in Fort Knox and all the rest of the reserves around the country. That being said, let's jump into some of the various states. All right, starting off with Texas. Obviously, Texas has been in the news a bunch here as of late, but they have pretty much been at the forefront of the sound money movement. If we take ourselves all the way back to July of 2015, Natural News had this article. It says, bankrupt, clueless California journalists portray Texas gold depository breakthrough as Looneyville. And of course, the woes of California back in 2015 are no different yet 6 years later. But at the same time, Texas has indeed advanced their cause in introducing sound money as well as putting in a depository. Why? Because most people tend to forget that Texas was a republic first, and they actually had not only their own grid, which we just saw the spectacular failure of here in recent weeks, but they also had their own money system as well, and their own gold deposits. Carrying that forward into May 2016, Texas plans to build their gold depository. That was out of Mises back then. Carrying that forward into November of 2017, we saw another step forward for sound money location was picked. That was out of Schiff Gold at the time. And lo and behold, flash forward about another 6-8 months or so into June 2018, 10th Amendment senator says, guess what? Texas Bullion Depository is now open for business. So from 2015 to 2018 took roughly about 3 years or so for things to actually get everything together and get their depository in order, but that's exactly where Texas is. And so carrying on that theme, Arizona also kind of along those lines. A number of things happened with Arizona dating back to February of 2017. Out of Activist Post, Arizona committees passes bill to support sound money. So even they recognize the need for having something other than just paper pieces of currency in your pocket that hold no value. InfoWars got in on it back in March of 2017. Arizona challenges the Fed's money monopoly. March 8th, 2017, we get Gold Money Investing, says Arizona states looking to make gold a legal tender in Arizona. And again, legal tender just meaning that you can use that to settle any and all debts, whatever those may be, or whatever debts you may have between parties. Over to the Free Thought Project in May 2017, the state passes landmark bill to end Federal Reserve's monopoly on money. And lo and behold, into May of 2017, we get Arizona governor approves House Bill 2014 to make gold and silver legal tender. And right around that time, we also saw Idaho make similar moves. Around March of 2017, they too introduced resolution to do the same thing, basically remove any sort of taxes pertaining to buying bullion, whether it be silver, gold, or otherwise. That being said, Utah got in on it as well, and we saw here February of 2017, Utah bill would set stage for gold and silver depository as well. They had what was known as the Legal Tender Act, creating a foundation for further action to encourage use of gold and silver as money. Not to be outdone, head over to South Carolina, and we had this from 2019, November-ish. South Carolina Legal Tender Act would treat gold and silver as money. So, that being said, you look at it, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, about 5 states, about, 20% of the union, if you look at it from that standpoint, all in favor of sound money, recognizing that our fiat currency system is either 1, broken, or 2, it doesn't hold water. The Federal Reserve, it does indeed hold a monopoly on the notes in your pocket. That being said, what else did we learn? Well, clear back in 2018, December 2018, we found, as an Anon quickly pointed out, says, do we have the gold? Meaning any of the reserves, net, and whatnot. And of course, we found out, yes, gold shall destroy the Fed. And of course, there we see the Eccles building and that over in D.C. So that's kind of the makings of a PSA I've got on the front end, kind of laying the groundwork. Now, that being said, let me jump into some of the rest of the articles that I've got here on the evening. Let's see here. There we go. Let's get that brought up. Alrighty, here we go. Alright. So over to Mises. So the question, obviously, is gold money? Well, it should go without saying that yes, it is. Obviously, for those that probably come up through the public school system, learn anything about economics, or even into college, Econ 101 and the likes, chances are they probably don't hear too much about gold and silver. The question is, why? Well, do they want to keep you debt serfs and slaves forever? Probably. But now certainly is the time to pay attention, because there are movements around the country to reintroduce gold and silver as money. So Mises had this dating back a couple weeks ago. It says, is gold money? Many would say so. And a web search returns tens of thousands of additional affirmative responses. If you want to start a fight with a gold bug, take the opposite view. But is it so? To answer the question of whether gold is money requires a definition. This one from Wikipedia is typical. Money is anything that is generally accepted in payment for goods and services and in repayment of debts. The main uses of money are as a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value. Now, before I even move on, how much value do you think that piece of paper in your pocket holds? Not much, if any. If you're, I know I've got a few of you guys in the audience probably from Canada. My guess is that your fiat currency is much the same, as all fiat currencies eventually return to their inherent value of zero. But the US dollar here over the last however long it's been in existence, 90, 100 years, whatever, has lost about close to 85 to 90% of its value. So if you think of it this way, and this is what I always use as an example, if you have a $20 bill in your pocket, how far would that get you in buying groceries today versus, say, 20 years ago, right? How many more groceries could you buy back then with that same $20 note versus today? Obviously, you don't get that much here today. Wikipedia refers to three properties of money. However, according to the Austrian economist Karl Menger, its acceptability in trade is the defining property. While money undoubtedly does serve as a store of value and a unit of account, these properties are derivative, not definitional properties. The reason that a medium of exchange necessarily is also a store of value is the anticipation of exchange value in the future. Or, this point Menger wrote, says, it appears to me to be just as certain that the functions of being a measure of value and a store of value must not be attributed to money as such, since these functions are of a merely accidental nature and are not an essential part of the concept of money. Using the above definition, the question of whether any particular good is or is not money can be posed in this way. Is the good in question accepted as the final means of payment for transactions? At present, in the developed world, nearly every nation has its own money or belongs to a currency union, such as the EU. Some nations in the developing world use the US dollar. In highly inflationary environments, the local currency is often spontaneously rejected in favor of the dollar or another foreign currency. Hardly anywhere do we find gold generally accepted as a means of payment, so gold must fail the definitional test of moneyness. Is this the end of the argument? And so the end of a very short article? Not quite. Gold is not money, but it has most of the desirable properties of money, and the process by which it became money in the past gives some clues about how it may become money once again. A store of value is not necessarily a medium of exchange. As Menger says, a non-monetary commodity can serve as a store of value. Now think of Bitcoin, for example. Something that exists in a digital realm, can be stored in a digital wallet, was just here up until this weekend running about $58,000 per Bitcoin and has since tailed off in the last couple days. But what exactly gives a Bitcoin its value? It's your belief that it has value at the end of the day. But the notion that attributes to money as such the function of also transferring values from the present into the future must be designated as erroneous. Although metallic money, because of its durability and low cost of preservation, is doubtless suitable for this purpose also, it is nevertheless clear that other commodities are still better suited for it. Analyst Paul Van Eden has shown that gold has maintained its purchasing power relative to the time that the gold standard ended. In Is Gold an Inflation Hedge? I have provided links to Van Eden's articles and a more detailed discussion. I will summarize his analysis here. A theoretical gold price equivalent which would give gold the same purchasing power as it had at the end of the gold standard is calculated by taking the convertibility ratio of $35 in 1933 and then multiplying by a factor representing the growth in the quantity of fiat money from that time. Under the classical gold standard, gold was the entire world's money. By counting worldwide growth in currency, not only US dollars, and comparing it to a worldwide price currency index of the gold price, Van Eden avoids the pitfalls of looking only at gold's dollar price, which can experience significant volatility due to the dollar's exchange rate against other national currencies. Van Eden's research shows that, since the end of the gold standard, the price of gold in units of fiat currency has tracked its purchasing power equivalent price fairly well, oscillating in a band around its theoretical value. In essence, the purchasing power of gold has been reasonably stable in the time since the end of the gold standard, which is only another way of saying that gold has served as a store of value. Even today, most of the demand for gold is not for direct use, but demand to hold. In the developed world, people purchase coins and bars for storage in vaults. In other areas, people save by accumulating bullion jewelry. Distinct from ornamental jewelry, bullion jewelry has low workmanship value added. Its price is not much greater than the melt value of its metal content. I wrote the following in The Myth of the Gold Supply Deficit. The World Gold Council estimates that 52% of gold is held as jewelry. James Turk subdivides jewelry holdings into low carat and high carat. The former is purchased mainly for the gold value as an alternative to buying bars and coins. The latter is purchased mostly for fashion. According to Turk's estimate, which was published in 1996, monetary jewelry at the time accounted for about 60% of jewelry, with fashion jewelry accounting for the remaining 40%. However, even when made into jewelry, the gold is not destroyed and can come back into the market as scrap. The World Gold Council figures show significant recovery from scrap. Now, the gold continued to be a store of value post-gold standard was unexpected by many economists. In the early 1970s, when the dollar's link to gold was cut, economist Milton Friedman predicted that the price of gold would collapse. The Nobel laureate believed that the gold derived its value from its relationship with the dollar. Without gold backing, there would be far less demand for gold. There would, of course, continue to be industrial demand for the metal, but without monetary demand provided by the dollar, the vast supply that had been accumulated during the preceding centuries would overhand the market, depressing the gold price for the foreseeable future. Friedman could not have been more wrong. It was the dollar that collapsed in the 1970s, while the gold price in dollars began a bull run that was not eclipsed in nominal terms until late last year. A similar and still widely held view in the world of mainstream financial analysts is that gold has been demonetized. The argument goes like this. Central banks decide what money is. Central banks have determined that gold is not money. Therefore, gold is not money. Only the stupid gold investors haven't figured this out. This view of the gold market sees the price of gold as determined primarily by central banks, who own an estimated 10 to 17% of above-ground supply. The critical variable is how they will time the sales of their gold hoards without causing a selling panic, as market participants realize that their gold coins and bars have no monetary value. But why is gold a better store of value than most any of a vast number of other non-monetary goods? Why were Milton Friedman and other economists wrong? Their error was the assumption that political institutions have the final say over what is and is not money. But this is not so. The market has final say. Looking at the process by which money originated from barter helps to understand why. According to Menger, money came into being through the efforts of individuals to expand the range of goods they could acquire through exchange beyond the possibilities available. Some individuals in a barter economy begin by bartering their goods for a commodity that they do not need, but is generally in demand throughout the market, with the intention of later exchanging that commodity for other goods. This strategy is called indirect exchange. These astute traders realize that the acquisition by trade of their consumption goods that he needs can proceed much more quickly, more economically, and with a greater enhanced probability of success. So as societies moved from barter to monetary economies, different goods were in competition with each other for use as money. Over time, as monetary exchange expanded in proportion to barter, some commodities were found to work better as money than others, until only a handful of them became acceptable to everyone in trade. Those were gold and silver. What qualities have made gold and silver the winners of the monetary competition in centuries past? Well, the qualities most often cited by monetary historians are durability, divisibility, recognizability, portability, and scarcity, the difficulty of producing more of it, and a value-to-weight ratio that is neither too high nor too low. Too low a ratio would make it hard to carry enough for spending, while too high a ratio would make small transactions difficult and prevent the commodity from being sufficiently widely owned in the prior barter economy. Gold still has these qualities today. While fiat money has some of them, it fails the scarcity test. It is too easy to create more of it. And boy, howdy does it. All the Fed has to do is enter a few more zeros behind the ledger, per se, on the screen, and voila. Here we go. Inflation. The result of market competition is not necessarily permanent. Market competition is an ongoing process. Even when one commodity emerged as money, there continues to be competition from other non-monetary commodities. Once the world's money, even gold, could have lost its place had a superior alternative emerged, but that is not the reason we no longer use it. Political money did not prove its superiority through a market process. What happened instead was a politically imposed change from a better system to a worse system. Although the central bankers have used political means to replace gold with paper, they do not have the power to end the competition between their money and commodity money. The demonetization of gold by central banks has rigged the competition, but not ended it. Gold as money may not be over for all time. As the monetary system melts down, gold functions as shadow money, an alternative that competes with the political money. It remains a store of value because of its potential to become money again. There is continuing demand for gold as a hedge against the breakdown of the fiat system. Governments cannot force people to use their money beyond a point. The market will only continue to accept fiat money as long as it works well enough, or even not too badly. If governments debase their currency beyond a point where it maintains some value over time, people will stop using government currency and switch to something else. In countries suffering hyperinflation, or even just excessive inflation, people typically start quoting prices and accepting and trade in the more stable currencies of other countries. Earlier this year, VietnamNet reported that land prices are being quoted in gold rather than the local currency, the dong. The world is lurching through a serious monetary disorder. The proximate cause is the collapse of the housing bubble and the subprime credit crisis, but the ultimate cause is the inherently unstable monetary system foisted upon us by a banking cartel. Central bankers are called upon to act as lenders of last resort, but in their efforts to inflate their way out of the credit collapse, they risk igniting a hyperinflationary bonfire that will destroy the world's major fiat currencies. Gold was money once and could become so again. And so it's fun to see that this comes back around here yet again, as you see right there. Originally it was published back in September 2008, back when we had the banking crisis and that took place back then. But yes, here we are some 13 years later and still makes absolute sense for many of the same reasons, albeit some of the things that they cite here with housing and things of that nature, well, we've done far better than just having a housing bubble this time. Today we have the everything bubble. All assets have been inflated beyond measure, and of course the Federal Reserve has printed the hell out of the dollar, adding more digits than ever to the screen. And especially in 2020, during the course of the whole COVID business. Alright, so that being said, what about gold? Well, American Gold Eagle sales were up 455% in 2020. Again, dating back to the beginning of January here out of Schiff Gold, we find demand for physical gold and silver surged last year as smart investors sought safe haven from a record-breaking expansion in the money supply, record federal budget deficits, and quantitative easing set to infinity. And of course, quantitative easing is just a fancy word for adding more currency into the supply. That being said, sales of U.S. gold and silver bullion coins at the U.S. Mint hit a 4-year high in 2020. The Mint sold 884,000 ounces of American Gold Eagle coins last year. It was a 455% increase over the 152,000 ounces sold in 2019. It was the highest level of gold coin sales since 2016. American Silver Eagle sales increased by 101%, with 30.01 million ounces sold in 2020. Coin sales surged despite supply chain issues due to government lockdowns around the globe. The U.S. Mint had to temporarily shut down production at its New York facility in April due to COVID-19. Due to production cuts, there were no half, quarter, or 10th-ounce gold Eagle coins available several months last year. With demand high and supply short, premiums on gold and silver coins skyrocketed. When spot silver hit its low of around $12 an ounce in March, premiums shot up as high as $12 a coin. The busiest month of the year was March. The U.S. Mint sold 151,500 ounces of gold eagles and 5,482,500 ounces of silver eagle coins in that month alone. In fact, the Mint completely sold out of American silver eagle coins in March. The second biggest month for gold coin demand was in August, when the price of the yellow metal broke its all-time high and briefly pushed above $2,000 an ounce. The U.S. Mint sold 121,000 ounces of gold eagles that month. Demand for physical gold should remain brisk in 2021. There is no end in sight to the borrowing, spending, and money printing. Peter Schiff has been predicting inflation pressures will ramp up significantly in the coming year. In fact, we're already seeing the impacts of a weakening dollar. For instance, import costs have doubled and in some cases tripled. Commodity and agricultural prices are up. We are really going to reap the whirlwind of the inflation winds that we have been sowing for years, but particularly ever since COVID, Peter said of 2021. And the Federal Reserve has made it clear that it's not particularly worried about inflation. In fact, it has moved its policy goalpost to let inflation run hot. Inflation is bad news for consumers, but it's good news for gold and silver. So there you have it. Demand has been brisk. And what did we just recently have here, just in the last couple weeks, as we went through the whole Redditors and Robinhood saga and all that stuff with AMC and all the stocks and that going on there? Well, people were betting that silver would rise as well, and on one weekend we had at least 4 or 5 retailers of coins and that physically run out of inventory. That was just one weekend. And silver at the time, again, dating back only here just a couple weeks ago, really, sold out. And so who knows where the numbers are going to reside for this year. But if that is any indication, then it's going to be a bang-up year. So I would encourage folks, keep your eyes on the price of silver, especially if you can get your hands on it, do so, and soon. That being said, bills introduced in Mississippi and Tennessee would repeal sales tax on gold and silver. So again, keeping in tow with what I started off the broadcast with Texas, Arizona, Utah, Idaho, South Carolina, now we're seeing other states also get into the fray. Mississippi, Tennessee. So, again, what's one way that we can go against the fiat currency and take back control of our budgets, put a little sanity back in our savings? Well, this is one way. This brought to us again by Shift Gold here on the 27th of January. Bills introduced in the Mississippi House and the Tennessee Senate would repeal state sales taxes on precious metals bullion. This would not only relieve some of the tax burdens on investors in those states, it would also take a small step toward treating gold and silver as money instead of commodities. So yes, if you think about it, taxing money? How in the world are you supposed to tax what is otherwise known as money in other states? How can they do that? Well, it's like double taxation at the end of the day. It'd be like putting a tax on your dollar, I suppose. In this case, Mississippi Rep. Henry Zuber and Rep. Brady Williamson introduced House Bill 375 on January 18th. The proposed law would exempt gold, silver, platinum, and palladium bullion from the state sales tax. To qualify for the exemption under the proposed law, bullion must be refined and contain at least 90% gold, silver, platinum, or palladium, or some combination of these metals. And the sales price of the item must fluctuate with and depend on the market price of the underlying precious metal, and not on the item's rarity, condition, age, or other external factors. In Tennessee, Senator Rusty Crowe introduced Senate Bill 251 on January 20th. The proposed law would exempt certain coins, currency, and bullion from the state's sales tax. To qualify for the exemption, it must be manufactured in whole or in part from gold, silver, platinum, palladium, rhodium, or other precious metal, used solely as legal tender, security, or commodity in this or another state, the United States, or a foreign nation, and be sold based on its intrinsic value as a precious material or collectible item, rather than its representative value as a medium of exchange. Very interesting. Knocking down barriers. Sales taxes on gold and silver raise investment costs. Repealing these taxes knocks down one barrier that might keep some investors from considering physical metal for their portfolios. With the advent of electronic payment services, it's easier than ever to use precious metals in everyday transactions. Companies like Gold Money facilitate this, but taxes on precious metal bullion erect barriers to using gold and silver as money by raising transaction costs. Passage of these bills would take a small step toward undermining the Federal Reserve's monopoly on money by eliminating one hurdle to using gold and silver in everyday transactions. In effect, states that collect taxes on purchases of precious metals act as if gold and silver aren't money at all. Imagine if you asked a grocery clerk to break a $5 bill and he charged you a 35-cent tax. Silly, right? After all, you're only exchanging one form of money for another. But that's essentially what a sales tax on gold and silver bullion does. By eliminating this tax on the exchange of gold and silver, Mississippi and Tennessee would treat specie as money instead of a commodity. This represents a small step toward reestablishing gold and silver as legal tender and breaking down the Fed's monopoly on money. We ought not to tax money, and that's a good idea. It makes no sense to tax money. Of course, that's former U.S. Rep. Ron Paul during testimony in support of an Arizona bill that repealed capital gains taxes on gold and silver in that state. Paper is not money, it's fraud, he continued. The impact of enacting this legislation would go beyond mere tax policy. During an event after his Senate committee's testimony, Paul pointed out that it's really about the size and scope of government. If you're for less government, you want sound money. The people who want big government, they don't want sound money. They want to deceive you and commit fraud. They want to print the money. They want a monopoly. They want to get you conditioned, as our schools have conditioned us, to the point where deficits don't matter. Practically speaking, eliminating taxes on the sales of gold and silver cracks open the door for people to begin using specie in regular business transactions. This marks an important small step toward currency competition. The United States Constitution states in Article 1, Section 10, no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. Currently, all debts and taxes in the U.S. are either paid with Federal Reserve notes, which were authorized as legal tender by Congress, or with coins issued by the U.S. Treasury, very few of which have gold or silver in them. The Federal Reserve destroys this constitutional monetary system by creating a monopoly based on its fiat currency. Without the backing of gold or silver, the central banks can easily create money out of thin air. This not only devalues your purchasing power over time, it also allows the federal government to borrow and spend far beyond what would be possible in a sound money system. Without the Fed, the U.S. government wouldn't be able to maintain all of its unconstitutional wars and programs. The Federal Reserve is the engine that drives the most powerful government in the history of the world. So, back to Mississippi and Tennessee. Passing these bills would remove one of the tax barriers that hinder the use of gold and silver as money, and would also begin the process of abolishing the Federal Reserve's fiat money system by attacking it from the bottom up, pulling the rug out from under it by working to make its functions irrelevant at the state and local levels, and setting the stage to undermine the Federal Reserve monopoly by introducing competition into the monetary system. Constitutional tender expert Professor William Green said, when people in multiple states actually start using gold and silver instead of Federal Reserve notes, it would effectively nullify the Federal Reserve and end the federal government's monopoly on money. Over time, as residents of the state use both Federal Reserve notes and silver and gold coins, the fact that the coins hold their value more than Federal Reserve notes do will lead to a reverse Gresham's law effect, where good money, gold and silver coins, will drive out bad money, Federal Reserve notes. As this happens, a cascade of events can begin to occur, including the flow of real wealth toward the state's treasury, an influx of banking business from outside of the state, as people in other states carry out their desire to bank with sound money, and an eventual outcry against the use of Federal Reserve notes for any transactions. Once things get to that point, Federal Reserve notes would become largely unwanted and irrelevant for ordinary people. These two bills make up part of a broader movement at the state level to support sound money. So there you go. Again, quiver in the hat, if you will, for the states actually doing what they're constitutionally mandated to do, and that's actually use real money instead of the paper fiat currency that we currently carry. That being said, Kansas bill would make gold and silver legal tender in that state. And this dates back to just a couple days ago. Again, out of Shift Gold, says a bill introduced in the Kansas House would recognize gold and silver specie as legal tender and repeal all taxes levied on it. The legislation would pave the way for Kansans to use gold and silver in everyday transactions, a foundational step for the people to undermine the Federal Reserve's monopoly on money. The Federal Reserve is the engine that drives the most powerful government in the history of the world. Ron Paul popularized the slogan, "End the Fed," but Congress is nowhere near abolishing the central bank. Can't even come up with the will to audit the Fed. Even though state action can't end the Fed, there are steps states can take that will undermine the Federal Reserve's monopoly on money. By passing laws that encourage and incentivize the use of gold and silver in daily transactions by the general public, policy changes at the state level, such as the Kansas Legal Tender Act, has the potential to create a wide-reaching impact and set the foundation to nullify the Fed's monopoly power over the monetary system. A coalition of 4 Republicans introduced the House Bill 2123 on January 25th. The legislation would make gold and silver legal tender in the state, recognizing it as a medium of exchange for the payment of debts and taxes. In effect, gold and silver specie would be treated as money, putting it on par with the Federal Reserve notes in Kansas. Under the proposed law, legal tender means a recognized medium of exchange for the payment of debts and taxes. Specie legal tender would be defined as A. Specie coin issued by the United States government at any time, or B. Any other specie that a court of competent jurisdiction, by final and unappealable order, rules to be with state authority to make or designate as legal tender. By allowing the court to designate additional specie to be used as legal tender, Kansas could free its citizens from potential supply constraints imposed by the use of only United States minted gold and silver coin. More importantly, the people of the state of Kansas would be able to define what specie is considered constitutional tender, further distancing themselves from potential control of their competing currency by Washington, D.C. Practically speaking, the passage of House Bill 2123 would allow residents to use gold or silver coins to pay taxes and other debts owed to the state. In effect, it would put gold and silver on the same footing as Federal Reserve notes. House Bill 2123 would also repeal property and capital gains taxes on gold and silver. No specie or legal tender shall be characterized as personal property for taxation or regulatory purposes. Passage of this bill would build on a foundation set in 2019 when Kansas repealed the sales tax on gold and silver. Kansas could become the fourth state to recognize gold and silver as legal tender. Utah led the way, reestablishing constitutional money in 2011. Wyoming and Oklahoma have since joined. Knocking down barriers. Taxes on gold and silver erected barriers to using gold and silver as money by raising transaction costs. House Bill 2123 would exempt gold and silver bullion from state capital gains taxes. Passage on this legislation would eliminate a barrier to investing in gold and silver. It would also make it more practical to gold and silver in everyday transactions, a foundational step for people to undermine the Federal Reserve's monopoly on money. In effect, states that collect taxes on purchases of precious metals act as if gold and silver aren't money at all. And so, again, this looks like it starts to repeat some of the things of articles past, so we'll just cut from there. But bottom line, you can see where this is headed. A lot of states are starting to legislate this stuff. If you happen to be in a state that is not one of the ones prescribed, and by the way, it looks like I might have missed a couple here. I had forgotten about both Oklahoma and Wyoming, so I'm going to have to go back in and fill in my map. But we'll get that sorted out for the PSA that'll come out of this. I would encourage folks to take the bills net listed here, whether it be Mississippi, whether it be Kansas, or otherwise. Take those bills, send it to your various legislators, and say, look, where do you guys stand on this? Are you guys in a position where you would introduce this? And if you happen to be in a state that currently does not have, what I would call constitutional money, as opposed to the fiat currency that we currently have here today. All you can do is ask. Put it in front of them. Heck, take this broadcast, shove it their way as well. Say, look, this is where things are headed. We got 6, 8, 10 states here that are now leading the charge here. Don't you think it's about time that this state does the same? Right? All right. Well, that being said, another great article out of Gold Money here says, Crazy Days for Money. States back to the earlier part of the month here, February 11th. This article anticipates the end of the fiat currency regime and argues why its replacement can only be gold and silver, most likely in the form of fiat money turned into gold substitutes. Now, I guess before I get too far into that, for all you folks who probably are into cryptos and things of that nature, there is an argument to be made that yes, that could be considered money to some degree. Is it on par with gold? Personally, I don't think so. This article will get into some of that here as well. Alright, so it explains why the current fashion for cryptocurrencies led by Bitcoin are unsuited as future mediums of exchange and why unsuppressed Bitcoin has responded more immediately to the current situation than gold. Furthermore, the U.S. authorities are likely to suppress the Bitcoin movement because it is a threat to the dollar and monetary policy. Not only that, but if you consider what the Davos folks have looked at doing through the central banks, they have what are known as CBDCs, central bank digital currencies. And of course, the central banks have developed their own cryptocurrencies, I guess. I don't know if they've officially given them a name other than the acronym CBDC, but obviously it would run up against and compete with, at least at this point, with the likes of an Ethereum or a Bitcoin. This article explains why growth in GDP represents growth in the quantity of money and is not representative of activity in the underlying economy. The authorities' monetary response to the current economic situation is ill-informed, based on a misunderstanding of what GDP represents. The common belief in the fund management community that rising interest rates are bad for gold exposes a lack of understanding about the consequences of monetary inflation on relative time preferences. Rising interest rates will be with us shortly, and they will burst into the bond bubble with negative consequences for all financial assets and the currencies that have inflated them. In short, we are sitting on a monetary powder keg, the danger of which is barely understood by policymakers and which could explode at any time. So now we'll get into the introduction of this thing. And the other thing to highlight here, and I don't recall if this article gets into it or not, as I had previously read this back then. Think of this. The monetary policy right now is print, 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 print. And one of the things that has happened, obviously, if you've paid attention, whether it be EU or otherwise, what has happened? It started to drive negative interest rates. And eventually, guess what happens to those who actually still have any semblance of savings left in your deposits? Well, guess what? Instead of the bank paying you to keep your savings in there, it's going to get flipped. The script is flipped. And you, in turn, will be paying them to store your own money. So in essence, you're getting a haircut and getting less and less back out of it. So again, this paints a pretty good case for why gold and silver are going to become increasingly more important in coming years. Introduction. We have entered a period the likes of which we have never seen before. The collapse of the dollar and the dollar assets is growing increasingly certain by the day. The money printing of the dollar designed to inflate assets will end up destroying the dollar. We know this thanks to the John Law precedent 300 years ago. I last wrote about this 2 weeks ago. Here, and there's a link to that article. It says in 1720, it was just France and Law's livre. Admittedly, the British had their South Sea bubble at about the same time, but it was the Mississippi bubble, which proved that if you print money to puff up asset prices, you end up destroying the currency when the bubble bursts. The Bank of England didn't make that mistake, but today, led by the Fed, that is precisely what most central banks are doing. John Law has become global. And then there's the European Union and its Eurozone. Last week I explained how the Target 2 settlement system has become thoroughly corrupted by the bad debts throughout the Eurozone, and that the commercial banks have become horribly overgeared and vulnerable to the slightest knocks. That article is here. There can be little doubt that when the systemic corruption is exposed, the ECB and the euro will be finished. Timescale? Who knows? But it could be any day. Just one day. Any time from now. Most likely at the same time as the dollar collapses, because both events will likely be driven by higher interest rates, and those who are unprepared for it will lose everything. The speed at which rigged markets unravel can be extremely rapid. Many of us will remember the end of the Berlin Wall. For 70 years, the Soviets suppressed markets, killing dissenters in the tens of millions. And on November 9th, 1989, if you tried to escape from East Berlin to the west, you were shot. The next day, you were free to cross it. The end of communist suppression of markets took just one day. The equivalent today is when ordinary people no longer accept suppressed markets. It could be triggered by foreigners, suddenly realizing they are badly exposed. It could be Europeans, suddenly deciding to take their money out of the banks in somewhere not that significant, such as Greece. The dollar and the euro share a dangerous characteristic. The Fed and the ECB are printing dollars and euros respectively in massive quantities to finance government deficits, which have spiraled out of control. To facilitate this inflationary financing, they have suppressed interest rates and mispriced government debt. Only one thing can happen. Interest rates, which reflect the time preference of money, must rise to compensate holders and users of money for loss of purchasing power. Governments cannot suppress markets forever. Ask the Soviets. And by the way, I'll digress quickly here and say, think of what the socialists in charge, the commies in Congress, would like to do. Mass monetary theory, right? Endless printing of dollars, because debts don't matter. Deficits don't matter at the end of the day. We'll just print more to pay off our debts. Well, guess what? For every dollar you print through the Federal Reserve, it always comes with interest. That's the way it's always been. and yet there are never enough dollars in circulation to cover not only the dollars that were borrowed, but the interest on the dollars. Can't happen. It's a catch-22. You never get there from here. The danger is gradually dawning on the masses. Commodity prices are now rising while tranches of money are being helicoptered into every adult American's bank account. They'll spend much of it when there are not enough good jobs to match the demand. Ephemera, such as Bitcoin and Ether, have rocketed in price, surely reflecting the debasement of the dollar and other fiat currencies to the extent that even the financially illiterate know why they are rising. Small investors, acting as if they are the new professionals, are taking on the new patsies. Hedge fund managers who still think they are masters of the universe. The reversal of roles is nothing short of astonishing, nor is there any sign of ending. Of one thing that we can be certain, and that is after a century of increasing intervention and inflation by the Fed, including 50 years of no gold backing for the dollars at all, it is time for the financial Iron Curtain to be breached. The EU and the US between them represent nearly 40% of global GDP. No other country can survive a combined blow-up of these two entities, and we can be certain that when one fails, or falls, they both fail, and so do we all. History tells us that when governments lose control of their money, that markets, being the collective expression of human activity, return to sound money chosen by the people as their medium of exchange, and that has always been metallic money, gold, silver, and copper. And think back here in the last week, what has happened to the price of copper? Have copper futures not risen greatly? And I feel for the folks down in Texas who have burst pipes right now that are going to find out that replacing said pipes is going to be through the roof. Fiat interest rates rises will be unstoppable. Interest rates are bound to rise, reflecting a fall in fiat currency's purchasing power. But investors share a common misconception that rising interests are bearish for gold and silver. They point out that the higher the interest rate on fiat currencies or on investments such as government bonds, the greater the opportunity cost of owning physical metal, which they say pays no interest. The comparison is not valid because possession of physical gold is the equivalent of physical fiat cash, neither of which pay interest. But gold can be loaned or leased for interest in the same way as any fiat currency. The interest rate obtained is determined by the same factors, but the originary rate, that is to say the rate shorn of lending risk factors, is different. This refers to time preference, the preference of immediate ownership to possession at a future point in time. Since the comparison is between actual possession and the promise of possession in the future value of any form of money is naturally valued at a discount to its current value, and conventionally this is reflected in its originary interest rate. If a central bank issues additional fiat, a rational holder will assume its purchasing power in future will be less than that of the present. The element of time preference in favor of current possession will increase, reflected in the expectation of a lower future value for the currency and therefore a higher originary rate of interest to compensate. In a free market, this element of interest rates is marginally set between lenders and borrowers. Similarly, a rate of time preference for gold is decided in free markets. The takeaway is that time preferences for gold and fiat money are independent of each other. Now, let's assume that a central bank embarks on a policy of inflating its fiat currency by a considerable quantity. We can see that this will radically affect perceptions of future purchasing power, leading to materially higher interest rates. But that is resisted by the central bank, which increases its intervention in financial markets to ensure that interest rates remain suppressed. Part of that suppression is its claim that monetary policies will not lead to rising prices. In other words, to a loss of the currency's purchasing power. The suppression of the evidence of the consequences of monetary inflation for the purchasing power of currencies describes the current situation, not just for the dollar, but for all other fiat currencies to varying degrees. Now that monetary inflation has been accelerated to new levels, interest rate suppression cannot continue for much longer. Because without the recognition of time preference, a fiat currency becomes rejected in favor of goods and commodities, which can be expected to retain their value better than the currency. This is why the increase in the quantities of fiat currency is already leading to widespread increases in commodity prices. And think, I just talked about copper prices. By the way, what has happened to lumber futures for those of you who might wish to build a deck or perhaps a house? What are the material prices done here over the course of the last year, notwithstanding due to COVID and everything else? But lumber futures are also at an all-time high. All commodities are on the rise. This is when economic actors begin to experience the loss of the currency's purchasing power. The flight out of fiat money can only be stopped by the central bank realizing it must permit interest rates to properly reflect time preference. But with the financing of its government deficit in mind, the central bank is under pressure to restrain interest rate rises. Meanwhile, the time preference for gold will remain relatively stable, and gold becomes increasingly preferred to fiat so long as interest rates underrepresent that fiat's time preference. This is why in the inflationary 1970s, the gold price started the decade with a price of $35 and a Fed funds rate of 9.25%, and ended the decade at a peak of $850, while the FFR rose to nearly 20%, in contradiction of the erroneous belief that rising interest rates are bad for the gold price. And that, of course, is talking on a per ounce basis, as well as the interest rates. And that, if you look at them now, I cannot even tell you where they're at for a given savings account, but I can pretty much guarantee you you're probably earning in the neighborhood of about 0.1 to 0.15% APY, something along those lines. Ridiculous. Basically, zero interest. There are two ways to stop the gold price rising relative to fiat. The obvious one is to stop expanding its quantity in circulation, which will decrease the time preference between current and future ownership of the currency. This is always resisted by neo-Keynesian inflationists. The alternative deployed by Paul Volcker in 1980 and 81 is to raise interest rates above the rate of the currency's time preference to persuade holders to sell gold for fiat. Clearly, the conditions exist for interest rates to rise significantly, given the current degree of monetary inflation, which is arguably now entering hyperinflationary spirals for the dollar and other fiat currencies. This should not put off ownership of metallic money. Indeed, it should encourage it. So before I move on from that, think of what it's going to do to anything you buy if we are indeed in a hyperinflationary mode. Number one, just like back in 2008, when we saw this happen in grocery stores, you paid the same price for a lot of products, but you got less of it. A 64-ounce package of juice went down to 59 ounces, but you paid the same because they hoped that you wouldn't notice the delta in the package size. Cereals, much the same, and many other products on the shelf as well. Don't think for a second that it's not going to happen again this time around. You won't realize it, that you're paying the same price, but that box is just a little bit skinnier and packed with a lot more air in it and a lot less product. Metallic money is universal. The objects in the illustration below were recovered from the Anglo-Saxon burial at Sutton Hoo, dating from the 6th century, the excavation of which is the subject of a recent Netflix film, The Dig. Here we see some of the items. The purse lid, great buckle, ornate gold belt, and two identical shoulder clasps from the treasure. After 1,400 years, these gold artifacts are as good as the day they were created and illustrate the artistic skills of the people at that time. Gold has always been prized for its durability and ability to be worked into aesthetically valuable items, which are also the qualities required of a widely accepted form of money. According to Ludwig von Mises' regression theorem, money takes its utility from our experience of it, which in turn was based on its utility from the past. This way, gold's use as a medium of exchange can be traced back to its use value before it was used as money, and this link is obvious from the gold jewelry and iconography predating the end of barter. It continued into paper money and bank balances in the days when they represented gold substitutes and were freely exchangeable into gold coins. The introduction of exchange restrictions for gold turned paper money into fiat currencies, backed by nothing other than the faith in the issuer. But we still regress to our previous experience of its utility when it was backed by gold. That is, we accept it until the state so obviously abuses its role as guardian of everyone's means of exchange that we abandon it. Or we get to a point like Germany did after World War II, where you basically have to take wheelbarrows full of it around in order to buy just a loaf of bread. Hyperinflation, or even Venezuela here in recent years. Fiat money is destroyed by its creator. We know, or should know, that modern nation states have been increasingly abusing the privilege of being the people's guardian of circulating currency since the ending of the era of sound money. That was brought about by the First World War, after which all major nations expanded the quantity of their monies, even under the cover of a gold standard. Some notable European currencies collapsed. Under the leadership of Benjamin Strong, the Fed, along with the commercial banks, began to stimulate the U.S. economy in the early 1920s, leading to the Wall Street crash and the subsequent Depression. Inflationists blamed the Depression on the gold standard, leading to its replacement over time by purely fiat dollars. For America, and therefore for the rest of us, the important dates were the banning of gold ownership by executive order in 1933, ending convertibility for the American people, and the ending of the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1971, terminating dollar convertibility for the rest of the world's monetary agents. These measures were driven by excess government spending on priorities the public would not support with increased taxes. Not only was the solution to abandon the discipline of freely convertible gold, but to work up theories to do away with it. While inflationists were encouraged by governments to give credence to their inflationary policies even before Keynes invented macroeconomics in 1936, his new creed transformed monetary inflation from a recognized evil into a purposeful policy. Governments were now justified in expanding the quantity of money to manage the economy, and the consequence was inevitable. The debasement of fiat currencies has increased over time. Figure 1 shows the effect on the purchasing power relationship between gold and the dollar from the ending of the Bretton Woods Agreement. And here we see that, dating back to the early 1970s through and through. The Japanese yen is in yellow, US dollar in blue. The pound sterling and Japanese yen, euro, etc., all have dropped in value and purchasing power. Other than the Japanese yen, the other major currencies illustrated have lost over 98% of their purchasing power, measured in gold. It is the people's money being compared with that of their governments. Before the introduction of the euro, the gold/euro rate is calculated on the basis of its constituents. Official statistics tell a different story, particularly following the steadying of fiat currencies after the loss of purchasing power in the 1970s. Governments promised to link rising prices to a range of welfare payments and began to issue index-linked bonds instead of reverting to sound money. It was only a matter of a year or two before it was realized that the cost of inflation compensation would restrict governments from their preferred spending priorities. So, the answer was to amend the statistics. Consequently, after subsequent amendments, in recent years, the U.S. Consumer Price Index has increased at a heavily subdued rate, most recently 1.4% in 2020, while independent analysts using different methods compute a rate closer to 10%, which they say has varied little since 2010. Indications of official price inflation now mislead not just the public, but policymakers and governments as well. So, pursuing policy errors to destruction. So, according to, or adjustments to GDP by any measure of price inflation is simply baloney. If it is accepted that the CPI deflator is valid, then using properly constructed independent price indices must be equally valid. Applying the same statistical method, deflation of GDP by 10% annually, which is closer to the price inflation estimates of independent American analysts, would be equally valid. But that would have us believe that in real terms, GDP has more than halved over the last 8 years, and that over longer periods of time GDP would diminish to insignificance. This is obviously untrue, and therefore deflating GDP by an understated CPI must also be nonsense. Further commentary is therefore warranted to improve our understanding of what GDP actually represents. Monetary expansion does not increase the quantity of goods and services, but by adding to the GDP total, it simply increases prices. Central to this understanding is Say's law, discarded by the Keynesians because it inconveniently disproves Keynesians' macroeconomics. Say's law states that we produce in order to consume, and money is just the intermediary good that permits us to do so. If the money quantity is varied by factors exogenous to economic activity, such as printed by the state or by varying outstanding bank credit, apart from transitory effects, it cannot change the volumes of goods and services produced and consumed. It can only change the price at which the production is converted into consumption. For this reason, GDP does not measure economic activity, nor do additional quantities of money and credit represent economic growth. It therefore follows that if you adjust GDP by taking out the growth in money and credit, accepting actual recessions of production, you should end up with a straight line approximately at zero. In other words, it is not production and consumption that has changed, but subtracting increases in money supply is the only valid deflator. This conclusion is tested and empirically established in Figure 2. And here we see the increase in U.S. nominal GDP is due to money supply in terms of billions. So you kind of get the idea there. Nominal U.S. GDP in blue, M3 money supply and GDP less increase in M3, the money supply. Says it confirms our thesis that the increase in broad money supply is a single source of GDP growth. This is illustrated more clearly by the green line, representing changes in the difference, which, until 2019, oscillated tightly around zero. Any significant deviation, which, as in 2009, is a genuine contraction in economic activity, which occurred in the wake of the Lehman crisis. 2020 shows that adjusted for the extraordinary increase in M3, or the money supply, economic activity declined much more sharply than following the Lehman crisis in 2008. It shows the economy is in more serious trouble than indicated by GDP alone, because of the offset of monetary expansion. But because the Fed, and every other central bank for that matter, does not accept the truth revealed to them by Say's law, they are basing their monetary policy on dangerous misconceptions. Deflating the GDP number by any price inflation statistic is one critical error, and to confuse growth in the GDP number with genuine economic progress is another. But by depressing the CPI statistic, the Fed has created for itself the temporary leeway to print money at an accelerated rate in order to drive the GDP statistic higher. It amounts to a policy that is rapidly running the economy through the wealth transfers arising from monetary debasement, but that is neither recorded nor considered. The consequence will be the hastening of the end of the dollar as a fiat currency. And von Mises' regression theorem tells us that when the era of fiat money is finally over, the only medium of exchange we can return to is metallic, however long that transition may take. And perhaps, as indicated here this evening, it may be upon us far sooner than anticipated. So, in terms of the cryptocurrency rivalry, the relative supply argument, whereby Bitcoin has its supply capped at 21 million coins, posits that as we approach the final figure, it gets progressively more difficult go issue Bitcoin with over 19 million already existing. This compares with government currencies whose supply is growing rapidly, a point that is widely understood in financial circles and even in sections of the general public. A simple comparison between Bitcoin and fiat invites an assumption that Bitcoin is a new form of money, with its supporters jumping to the conclusion that it will replace gold as the alternative to fiat, and eventually fiat itself. That central banks are busy inventing their own central bank digital currencies is also seen by enthusiasts to give credibility to the wider crypto concept. For a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin to be accepted as money, it must be freely available for transactions and desired to be used as money by ordinary people, and not just the technologically savvy millennials. But if the supposed new money is increasing in purchasing power ad infinitum because of its lack of new supply, who in their right minds will part with it for goods? Who will regard it as the objective value in their transactions? Who will borrow Bitcoin to invest in production when the cost of repaying the principal will guarantee a loss on the project? And how would a Bitcoin bond market operate? Fans of Bitcoin as tomorrow's money are ignoring the characteristics required of a usable form of sound money. All the questions raised in the previous paragraph must be answered positively, but if it is to become the new money, the post-fiat world will be plunged into a permanent depression. By way of contrast, gold is sufficiently flexible to operate as money, and furthermore, we have a legacy to point to of spectacular economic progress under a gold standard through the 19th century until the outbreak of the First World War. Not only does gold provide satisfactory answers to all those questions in the penultimate paragraph, but most central banks possess some physical gold, but as far as we are aware, none have Bitcoin. They are also busy inventing their own digital currencies, but they are just fiat by another name. Far from embracing the cryptocurrency concept, it is in the interest of central banks to quash distributed ledger competitors to state-issued currencies. When fiat currencies fail, the only option will be for them to turn distributed fiat into gold substitutes. For a failure to do so will mean that governments will be unable to pay any of their costs, including politicians' salaries. Oh, wouldn't that be absolutely terrible? No worries, they don't make much off the salary they get. That comes from K Street, right? Lobbyists. I digress. Meanwhile, cryptocurrencies are on a tear. The success of Bitcoin threatens to be seen as an embarrassing rival to the dollar by the Fed and U.S. Treasury. And now the Biden administration is getting to grips with the business of government. It will be surprising if Ms. Yellen, the new Treasury Secretary, doesn't address the issue soon. And I believe she did here even today, stating that she's not a fan of Bitcoin. Interestingly, those supposed masters of the universe who recently lost out so spectacularly to Robinhood's private punters are now making the sort of price forecast for Bitcoin that in previous equity bull markets were made by bellhops, lift boys, and taxi drivers, reliably marking the top of the market. 1929 refers. Crazy times, indeed. So why is gold not reflecting the hyperinflation of the dollar? Well, one reason Bitcoin hodlers see Bitcoin becoming the new money is the gold price's muted response to increasing monetary debasement compared with that of Bitcoin. It is also argued that when investors would previously hedge fiat debasement by buying gold, they are now buying Bitcoin. Now, there may be some truth in the deflection of buying from gold into Bitcoin, but the argument fails when it is realized that the vast majority of buyers of Bitcoin anticipate selling for a profit in the buyer's base currency. The similarity is not with physical gold, but with investing in mines, ETFs, and paper gold. The real reason for gold's underperformance is the establishment's long-established antipathy towards it, something that should serve as a warning to hodlers of Bitcoin. To regard gold as sound money is to turn one's back to Keynesian macroeconomics, something the U.S. government, with its interest of promoting and retaining dollar hegemony, has actively discouraged. In order to absorb demand for physical gold, it has fostered the growth of paper markets, which can be expanded by the bullion banks at will. This policy goes beyond precious metals and includes base metals and other industrial raw material as well, allowing the dollar to retain a more stable value measured against them than would otherwise be the case. Consequently, bullion banks take the short side in the futures market, hedging long positions in London's forward market. But today, the physical liquidity in London has virtually disappeared, replaced with unallocated gold, amounting to gold claims on the bullion banks. Other than the drip feed of mining supplies and scrap metal, the principal supply of physical is from leasing by the central banks, which store gold in the Bank of England's vault. But in these overtly inflationary times, it is likely that central banks will place greater emphasis on having their gold reserves both earmarked and unencumbered. The precariousness of the situation was revealed in January 2020, when the bullion bank cohort made a determined effort to collapse open interest on COMEX futures from a record 799,541 contracts on the 15th of January 2020. They succeeded, bringing open interest down to 469,893 contracts in early June. But while they managed to reduce open interest, they failed to reduce the monetary value of their short position. Figure 3 shows the distribution of COMEX gold contracts of 100 ounces each, and the changes between the commitment of trader figures on 15th of January 2020 and the most recent position today. And here you kind of get a feel for that. But again, shorting. And what did we just see again play out with the folks on Reddit? The street bets and Wall Street bets and whatnot with AMC and everything else, right? Before we can examine the statistics in Figure 3, it will be helpful to those familiar with the COMEX futures market to offer some explanation. They are presented to show the positions of non-speculators, defined in two categories: swaps, which represent the bullion banks' trading desks, and producers and merchants, which are mines, refiners, and processors. The speculators are managed money, mostly hedge funds and algorithmic traders. Other reportables being those who do not fit in other categories, and non-reported who are traders small enough to be non-reportable. The non-speculator's net position always balances those of the speculators, and the tables in Figure 3 reflect it. And looking at the changes between two dates can impart valuable information. In addition, we should know that on the 14th of January 2020, the gold price closed at $15.46, and on 2nd of February this year it closed at $18.37. Despite the swap's success in reducing open interest overall and reducing their net shorts by 14,849 contracts, their net exposure measured on dollars was actually increased from $32.261 billion to $35.61 billion. Analysts have traditionally regarded this gold contract as a tussle between the managed money category and the swaps, with the hedge funds taking the long side. When they are very long, reflecting a preference for gold over dollars, they have proved vulnerable to bear raids by the swaps, who know the stop-loss positions and can actively trigger them. Furthermore, very few hedge funds are interested in delivery of physical metal, which makes them vulnerable to pressure to close their positions as contract expiry nears. So successful have these maneuvers by the swaps been in the past that what happens to the gold price is secondary to the level of hedge fund bullish exposure. The history of it is illustrated in Figure 4. Here we see the net managed money longs versus gold price. So carrying on that theme, we get the correlation is directional, with rises and falls in the managed money, net positions rising and falling with the gold price. This is because bullion banks control the market. When the hedge funds are long, they are forced to sell into a falling market, driving the price lower, which allows the swaps to cover their short positions profitably. And when they have recovered their shorts, they allow the price to run up, encouraging the hedge funds to go long again so that this highly profitable exercise can be repeated. The hedge funds are cast as useful idiots, and they have fallen for it every time. That is, until recently. The table in Figure 3 above shows a remarkable change. Between January 2020 and today, the hedge funds have reduced their proportion of their total speculators' positions from 60% to 37%. This is all the more remarkable because their net longs have fallen by 142,681 contracts. Instead, the other reported category has increased its share of the total from 26% to 47%, amounting to an increase in their net longs of 80,572 contracts. It is this COMEX category which has been increasing its net longs and standing for physical delivery at contract expiry. This is a headache for the swaps, because in the past, they were only occasionally required to deliver physical metal. The problem now is that the other reported category is hovering up scarce bullion which the bullion banks don't have. They are not the useful idiots with which the swaps have become accustomed. With this information, can now deduce why the price of gold has not reflected the change in monetary inflation from March 2020 as much as it might have. When the Fed cut its funds rates to zero and began an accelerated quantitative easing of $120 I'm assuming that's $120 billion every month, the bullion banks have failed in their attempts to cut their short positions. Instead, they have become desperate to sit on the price for fear of greater losses. But with hedge fund participation diminished, their only hope is to somehow shake out the other reported longs. Their attempts to do so have repeatedly failed and are likely to continue to do so. Figure 5 shows how the other reported net longs have kept on climbing since mid-2018, during the time hedge funds have collectively given up. And here we kind of see that, the other reported net long gold contracts. So, it is only a matter of limited time before the swap's dangerous position leads to a run against them, and perhaps silver will become the catalyst. So again, talking about silver, here we go. Silver turns a screw on the paper system. Flushed with their success from causing losses to the hedge funds careless enough to short illiquid stocks 2 weeks ago, Robinhood's traders turned their attention to silver, and more specifically the SLV ETF, as a means of squeezing the bullion banks. Between 28th of January and the small hours of February 1st Eastern Standard Time, they forced the price of silver up $4.75 to a high of $30.10. At the same time, gold rose $36, platinum rose $64, and even the oil price began to rise, with West Texas Intermediate going from under $52 to $58 currently. Perhaps not all of this can be attributed to Robinhood traders, but they certainly upset the apple cart. The SLV's authorized participants, those licensed by SLV to submit physical metal and in return have shares created, have been forced to find over 2,850 tons of silver to deliver to the custodian, J.P. Morgan, London. According to Ronan Manley of Bullion Star, total ETF silver holdings in London are 28,649 tons, over 85% of all vaulted silver in the LBMA's bailiwick. With much of the rest held in custody for other parties, there is virtually no liquidity. Nor, so far as we can gather, is there any liquidity in Switzerland either. What the Robinhood crowd appears to have done is to alert the world to the shortage of silver. As a catalyst, they might even have succeeded where the Hunt brothers failed to corner the market in 1980. Initially, the bullion banks managed to slam the paper price back to $26 last Thursday, since which silver appears to be resuming its climb. This inversion, whereby a crowd of small investors can threaten to destabilize markets, is yet further evidence of the fragility of the markets. So, in conclusion, summary and conclusion here. Physical gold and silver bullion are the only protection available against the ending of fiat currencies. By the following reasons, we can summarize why they should be hoarded by individuals to protect themselves from the end of fiat money. A collapse in the dollar's purchasing power together with its Fed-inflated financial asset bubble and of the euro as a consequence of thoroughly corrupted settlement and banking systems are increasingly difficult to defer. Other central banks around the world are accelerating the destruction of their fiat currencies by accelerating their money supplies. Furthermore, the reserves are overwhelmingly comprised of dollars and euros, which are increasingly likely to turn out to be valueless. Ill-founded macroeconomic beliefs have led to increasing levels of misguided monetary policies. Central bankers do not understand the difference between GDP and economic progress, and government statisticians suppress evidence of price inflation to justify inflationist policies. The true scale, the damage being caused by monetary policies, is becoming understood by the public, reflected in the flight into Bitcoin. A collapse of fiat currencies will not come as a total surprise. Of course, we'll see the pundits on TV, on CNBC, and the Kramers alike say, "Gee, we had no idea, did we? I didn't know that was there." BS. The belief that Bitcoin is the post-fiat future money does not take into account the requirements of a functioning medium of exchange. It is not suited to the challenge, and it will be increasingly seen by government as the enemy of their fiat currencies. The gold price has been suppressed, originally as a matter of monetary policy, so as to not expose the consequence of inflationism. But today, because the futures and forwards markets have run out of physical liquidity to back them, they are acting like a dam holding back the floodwaters. That dam could burst at any moment. And when the dam bursts, it will be part of a wider problem involving the bursting of bond bubbles and the collapse of the world's fiat currency regime. The sheer scale of the financial change presents a worrying parallel to the fall of the Soviet system in its potential suddenness. The only protection is to hoard physical sound money vaulted outside the banking system. Price is immaterial. Those who have no physical gold or silver are unlikely to have the opportunity to correct their error. So there you have it. Again, a little bit of a long read here, but nonetheless, well worth it. And so that's what I'll leave you with here this evening, just to give you an idea of where things are headed. Again, as I've gone through this and kind of showed on the front end here, my plan is to actually turn this into a bit of a PSA to be played periodically on the shows, so people understand where our monetary system is actually going and why there's a significant need to get out of the fiat system. One, you're not going to make any money with your banknotes sitting in a bank that basically earns no interest. You're much better off having something physical in your hand to be able to barter with, and what better way to do that than something that's always maintained its value for over 5,000 years. The same history is just not there with Bitcoin, and it's quite speculative at best. Again, if you just use this past weekend as an example, it had been run up over 50,000, 58,000 I think was the top that it hit, and here in the last couple days it has started to trend back down. So not good. And of course you guys, in terms of preserving any semblance of wealth, obviously that's you guys' decision to do whatever you see fit. I'm just showing you here via some financial articles what has been done traditionally in the past, and usually it has worked out very well. So that's what I'm going to leave you with here this evening. Appreciate you guys tuning in as always, and again, be sure to like, share, subscribe to the channel, share this information out far and wide, and we will see you back here shortly on the next one. Take care. God bless everybody.